welcome to Quadriga. Venezuela is bracing for further, potentially deadly protests as his embattled president targets the young politician seen by many Venezuelans as the only hope of breaking the grip of a corrupt elite that has plundered the country. President Nicolas Maduro has presided over a dramatic economic collapse. Declaring the president illegitimate, Juan Guaido, leader of the democratically elected National Assembly, stood before tens of thousands of frustrated Venezuelans last week and had himself sworn in as acting president pending new elections. The police have fired on demonstrators, killing dozens, and they've carted off hundreds to jail. For now, the army's on the side of the regime. The U.S., on the other hand, was quick to recognize Guaido and has not ruled out intervention. Power struggle in Venezuela. Who's winning? That's our title this week, and these are our guests. It is a pleasure to welcome Ana Solis de Stanga. She is a research fellow at the University of the Federal Armed Forces in Hamburg, and she says the democratic transition in Venezuela has to continue. Venezuela must hold new presidential elections. And it's great to have Thomas O'Donnell with us. He's an American who works as an analyst and consultant and also teaches at the Freie University of Berlin. He says the Hugo Chavez model of development that he called oil socialism has destroyed the social fabric of Venezuela. And great to have with us as well Ivo Hernandez. He is from Venezuela and he works as a political science professor at Germany's University of Münster. He says the return to democracy in Venezuela may mean the fall of a second communist Berlin Wall. So, Ivo, that is a pretty optimistic comparison.
It is.
The fall of the wall. Venezuela has been spiraling downward for years. Why are you so confident that this phase could finally now be coming to an end?
Because it's the first time when we see this internal and external pressure coming together. We've seen before some internal protests. We've seen some people who had stood up to the government. They paid it really high. They were sent to prison, many of them. Many had to leave the country. But now we see for the first time democracies of the world coming together and supporting a democratic regime, which is the regime that Juan Guaido is portraying right now as president of the National Assembly, and because of constitutional prescriptions, he's now the interim president of the country.
So, Anna, you say that the democratic transition must continue. What has to happen for it to do so?
So the next step has to be that they have to call for presidential elections. No, and right now, following your question, is possible because one of the internal factors that make that possible is that the opposition finally has a voice, has a representative, has a Guaido. So the international community and also the people in Venezuela have right now faced a leader that can lead this transition in the country.
You say there have to be presidential elections. Mr. Maduro has now said he's willing to negotiate, maybe willing to see new parliamentary elections held. But that wouldn't do it, huh?
No, that sounds like a little really bad joke, no? Because the General Assembly had already the election in 2015. So what is in question is this illegitimate presidency of Maduro.
Tom, your opening statement referred to oil socialism. It seems like a paradox. President Maduro is actually a dyed-in-the-wool socialist, a former bus driver. So how did he come to preside over what amounts to a kleptocracy of a corrupt elite?
He didn't create it. It was handed to him by Hugo Chavez, who preceded him. Chavez had to decide who was going to follow him when he died, and he anointed him sort of shortly before he died. When I say oil socialism, this model of socialism isn't anything that Marx or anybody else would ever think of. When the country was in grave crisis for numbers of years, and so they turned to this person, this military leader, Hugo Chavez. But he had no experience in running anything, and he had no opposition party and so forth. And what he did over time is he used the largesse of the money coming in from oil, which was a huge amount of money, to distribute. But it turned out he didn't build anything. It was clientelist distribution. And not only, even when the price of oil was highest, he was still borrowing money from Wall Street and later then from the Chinese and then from the Russians, basically to buy elections. So it can appear very popular. I'm giving money to the poor. I'm building this. I'm building that. And then you go back later and you tour these places and nothing is completed. You're constantly moving on to something else, creating the basis for a huge kleptocracy.
Exactly. If I may elaborate a little bit on that, I think what Tom has just portrayed is clearly what they call the socialism of the 21st century, which is this model of clientelism for different classes and different countries, just giving money away to get support either in the organization of American states by voting whatever resolutions there were, either by getting international support. That is coming to an end now, because we see for the first time democracies then together working and dismantling this huge lie disguised under institutional socialism, as we can call it. Yeah.
Let's take a deeper look at the economic situation in Venezuela today. By all rights, it should be a wealthy country. It possesses the biggest oil reserves in the world, but millions of its citizens live in grinding poverty, unable to feed their families.
Venezuela's hyperinflation has been estimated at 1 million%. Nowhere has its impact been as devastating as among the country's poor. Freddie Martinez needs medication, but cannot afford to buy any. I spend all the money I have on food. When there is food to buy, that is. Across the country, queues are growing outside stores, with people sometimes waiting for hours for new stock to arrive. And what does arrive is swiftly snapped up. The minimum wage is not even enough to get by on basic food staples. The country's hospitals are full of children suffering from malnourishment and diseases. Last year was incredibly tough for me and for everyone in Venezuela. Amid rising tensions on the street, will the frustration erupt into protests or violent unrest?
Ivo, 9 of 10 families are unable to afford sufficient food to feed their families. And we're not talking only about the absolute lower classes, but the middle class, in fact. Health system is breaking down. How can the Maduro regime possibly hold out under these circumstances?
It's incredible to say that. And also, if you put that together with about what the International Monetary Fund says for this year, which is an inflation of over 10 million%, that's about one of the biggest in history. We're having a humanitarian crisis, and that's precisely the problem, and that's why Maduro cannot stay anymore. Not even as a government, he's not anymore government, but his figure is the representation of chaos in Venezuela, of disaster. He's been a catastrophe for the country. He and his administration together.
Ana, why should we assume that things would really change under Juan Guaido?
Because, this crisis in Venezuela and this humanitarian crisis actually is a process that has a long time already. That we can say it's beginning in 2002, 2003 with the exchange control. And then we have in 2013 when Chavez died, that Maduro didn't really did the structural changes that the system needed. And right now, why we can think that Guaido can success? Because then Guaido can have the help of the international community. They can already have some resources that the Maduro regime cannot get.
Can you tell us just a little bit about Guaido himself? He's only 35 years old. He seems, essentially, for most of us who don't follow events in Venezuela that closely, to have come out of nowhere. How did he come to crystallize this frustration that we saw in the report?
Yeah, it's the leader that this transition needed. It's a fresh person, fresh leader that is come more for the line of Leopoldo López that is already in prison. Before that, he came into the presidency of the General Assembly. We read some academic report that say he is more really radical. But I think that he can success because he showed that he can really hear all the people, or the Venezuelan people. So he is not talking anymore about only we are the opposition and we are against the Chavistas. He is talking about, we want to unify Venezuela, and he's using this discourse for all Venezuelan people, and that's, I think, is key.
Plus, he can't be blamed for the 2002 coup. He was just too young for that. Which is a very common blame. It says, you were part of the coup, you're part of this radical opposition. He was not. He can't be blamed. That was about 16 years ago. The man was too young for that.
Okay, it's a new phase, no?
So, Tom, let me talk to you a little bit about this external pressure several of you have mentioned. The U.S. was very quick to recognize Guaido as the now legitimate acting president. Is this really about Venezuelan democracy, or is it about Venezuelan oil? From the perspective of the U.S.
Okay, so this is one of the oldest tropes from back when Chavez came to power in the first place. What is the role of oil in Venezuela? And really, I was there as a Fulbright scholar for 2 years and have been back many times. And through all the various confrontations, it was impossible to see how the U.S. was doing something in order to get control of the oil. The United States has plenty of oil. The market is flooded with oil. Yeah. There's no particular reason to make this about oil right now. So it's got to do with the logic of the actual crisis itself, the huge numbers of refugees, and the patent, illegitimacy of the present government. However, okay, so you ask about the oil. The thing is, as I said before, when I said Chavez's program was oil socialism, I mean, I heard him call it that. Without this tremendous amount of income that was coming in, when the price of oil was astronomically high for all those years, he would have completely collapsed. You mentioned a coup earlier. So by 2002 or 3, after he was in power for 3 or 4 years, he had no program. Things were falling apart. And it was when he defeated this sort of coup that the price of oil was rising very rapidly, and he started all these distributive programs with the advice of Castro to make things like, in the barrios, to make missions to the poor with using Cuban doctors and so forth. The thing is, they were really totally incompetent. Venezuela is really a bit of an anomaly. I study OPEC countries. Other OPEC countries can have a war going on, can have their second biggest city occupied by ISIS, and have the production of petroleum increase. Venezuela, with nothing like that, with complete political corruption, was declining because of the incompetence of his government and the amount of corruption which he had no idea how to do anything about.
And tying the political model to that economic system, that's also a problem. Yes.
Yeah.
Let me just drill a little bit deeper on the U.S. role.
And then you're getting into the United States.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to hit this thing. Yeah. It's really not about that, okay, in this case. There's nothing in the oil market to explain this. So what's happening is it's really come to a point where something has to be done for the Venezuelan people and for the whole region.
Yes.
You know, whether you're altruistic or pragmatic. Colombia is flooded with hundreds of thousands of refugees. So is Brazil. Yes. So are many other countries. The amount of Venezuelans in Europe is more than people coming from North Africa. So the United States...
The puzzling thing about this move is, you know, Donald Trump has said so many times, we are not going to get involved anymore in other people's problems. Well, we're going to leave it up to them. And now suddenly the U.S. is once again asserting itself in Latin America, which is certainly not for the first time. Could there be some truth to what President Maduro is saying, that the U.S. is orchestrating this for its own political gain?
Yes, I see. I wouldn't doubt, in fact, I'm quite sure that Guaido and the opposition had detailed discussions not only with the Americans and the Canadians, but also with the Colombians especially and with the Brazilians, because of the nature and the Organization of American States. The day that Guaido announced that he was taking the interim presidency, threw out the Venezuelan representatives, say you're no longer a legitimate country. So yes, they talked to all of them. But here's the thing. One reason I understand from talking to, just the other day, I was talking to people in the oil sector in Venezuela. I talk to them all the time. One reason he explained to me he thought the Americans had to move so quickly the other day was Maduro can sell the assets, for example, of Citgo in the United States. And they had to move rapidly to freeze things so that he wouldn't take advantage of that. Half of Citgo is mortgaged to the Russians, and Sechin wants to be paid. It's terrible, the things the Russians are doing, sending armed men and so forth. But they're actually out to get their money.
Stop you there because it's going to become too complex. But Ivo, one question in regard to this U.S. support for Guaido. Could it wind up proving counterproductive? Could that, in fact, turn people against Guaido? Because certainly if there's one thing that often unites Latin Americans, it is opposition to U.S. intervention.
Well, not only Latin America, part of Europe is also joined into that. But we got to be really serious on that. I would support what Tom just said. It's as simple as this old imperialistic talk of the 60s. Not anymore. What we're seeing here is democracies standing up for each other and helping each other. We just talked about the crisis of people migrating out of Venezuela. And we have to say Germany went almost to its economical knees in 2 years ago when they had over 1 million people. Brazil and Colombia have already surpassed that number. And they're tiny economies compared to Germany. And they're having an influx of people every day who are escaping because of that, what we just saw, which is a crisis in humanitarian, no medicines, no food, and all that. So what we're having here is Trump, regardless of what you may think of his administration, please take anti-Trumpism out of the picture. What we're having is democracy standing for democracies. We need the help of the United States and we need the Europeans. Europe has to stay with us.
Okay, so let's talk about...
And I think that the scenario for the United States is different right now because who are asking for support for this transition process is the own people in Venezuela, but also the region. So this scenario didn't have before the United States, but right now you have the Lima group, you have the Latin American countries that are asking also for support. Then that is really economic support and probably the talk and dialogue with the opposition. That's
it. I want to take us now into the future. Sure. So let me just ask you, Anna, do you think, we heard at the end of the report just now the question about the degree to which we could see this all erupt into violence. So first question to you, could Venezuela be on the brink of a civil war?
I don't think so, that the Venezuelan people want to go to the civil war because they are not anymore. We cannot say they are supporting really Maduro. The people are really looking for food, medicine, so they just needed also this transition. And on the other side, some kind of military intervention for external intervention, I don't think so that is necessarily. Some weeks ago, so many people were talking about that, but the scenario right now, how it's playing, I think it's possible to find a democratic way for this crisis.
So, interestingly enough, Juan Guaido's move to declare himself president occurred on the anniversary of a military coup 61 years ago that, in fact, ushered in an era of Venezuelan progress. Many say now the military holds the key to resolving the current standoff.
Nicolás Maduro attending military drills last week in a public display of appreciation for the armed forces. For the beleaguered president, they are the key to his power and political survival. He's backed by most senior military commanders, who in turn enjoy privileges under the regime. As Juan Guaido knows only too well, which is why he's been appealing to ordinary soldiers who can barely live off their wages to join his side. Guaido is promising an amnesty for those who defect. His supporters have been going to army barracks to hand over copies of the offer. And this high-ranking officer could be the man who turns the tide. Colonel José Luis Silva, defense attaché at the Venezuelan embassy in Washington. He has called on other members of the military to join him in recognizing Guaido as interim leader. Will the armed forces change sides or help to put down the protests?
So that question goes right to you, Ivo. Can Maduro be certain of the army's loyalty going forward?
Okay, allow me to make a little space for to answer the idea of the civil war, then I go back to that immediately. The idea of civil war is impossible in Venezuela. We've had, until now, it's a war against civilians. And that ought to be underlined. That's what we've had. A small group of people with enormous support from international spheres having or waging a war against people without weapons, without anything, without food. To the point of the military, I would say Venezuela is quite a complicated issue because the military is fragmented. You just have to know that when you know that there is also this drug problem, which many of the military control. They also control the dealing with gasoline, which is extremely cheap, has no price at all in Venezuela. So we see a very fragmented military. Their support cannot be counted on. Maduro stays, or a small elite, you could call it like that, still loyal to him. how long will that last? We just don't know. We think it might not be that long, especially counting on the international support we're getting from the United States and from European countries.
So amongst that support are oil sanctions. In fact, the U.S. imposed those as well very quickly. Could that swing the military toward Guaido, or is it likely, again, to simply inflame passions? Because, after all, the top brass has earned millions, billions from oil.
Mm-hmm. See, okay. So it gets back to the question of what's the military going to do. And it's not so clear. I think what has to take place, if there's right now the big push, is to have some kind of a negotiated agreement for a transition to bring an election, in which case the military will be very happy to immediately say, yes, I support this. And they're not in trouble, they continue on. Without that, without Maduro agreeing to that, somehow being forced to that, it's not clear what they're going to do. It could disintegrate, and there's all sorts of armed groups in the country. It could turn into a Lebanon sort of situation. And I think that's part of what the United States is up to. And the OAS, the Organization of American States, they want to bring the pressure maximum now to get a transition now, to get a negotiated agreement that there's going to be an election, the military is neutralized, or else it all falls apart.
So what does it take to neutralize the military? And I know that you studied in Chile, and when I was doing the research for this program, I found material about the amnesty that the military got there in order to hand over power. And amongst other things, top commanders were granted not only permanent positions, but also 10% of copper revenues in perpetuum went into the military budget. Is that kind of an arrangement conceivable here? And is it a necessary evil, or does it perpetuate dysfunction?
So the situation in Venezuela with the military, the army force is really special. You've already mentioned they control everything in the country. Since 2013, Maduro gave all the power to the military because it was the only way that he can support their power. Right now, with the amnesty, it's a really good signal for the military that they can really maybe change the position. But the high rank in the military, that is the problem, because they are so involved with Maduro that I don't think so that they can easily to change to other side or to support Guaido. Therefore, the scenarios are different. It's difficult to say how they really will react in this situation. All will depend on the perception of they have, that they really think that Guaido will success in this process, in this transition. Probably they will support Guaido, but we don't know it.
This is a perpetual problem for the opposition that has to do with the structure of Venezuela, the class structure. Chile, Argentina, Brazil, there were there were dictatorships. However, once the democratic opposition got so strong, people would have a general strike. The big capitalist class was usually with the government, but they said, hey, we can't make money anymore. I'm sorry, guys, we want a transition. In Venezuela, they've already had that for years. Huge demonstrations, shut down the country. There's no capitalist class that can go and say to the government, I'm sorry, step out, we'll help you get out of the way. This is bad for business, because the government controls all business.
Also because
they have no leverage like that.
If I may say, also because
briefly.
Very briefly, because also Venezuela it's a place where joint forces are taking place. I mean, what I want to say is you have terrorism from Hezbollah is in Venezuela. You have drug dealers and cartels working there. You have Russia. You have China. You have non-democratic governments helping the people in power, or the people who were in power. That has made them able to stay for so long. What we have now is the support, finally, of democracies. This may sound perhaps simplification, but it's democracies against non-democratic governments.
Let me ask you, support from democracies, how far that support would go. The U.S. has not ruled out military intervention, if needed, to come to Venezuela's aid. We saw John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, this week holding up a piece of paper where it was clearly legible, 5,000 soldiers to Colombia.
Well, I don't know if I don't know if that means military intervention in Venezuela, but I would say what we need is a humanitarian intervention, and definitely you must have military personnel to guarantee that from A to B, the food and the medicines get to go to the people.
Unfortunately, the Venezuelan people have gotten to this nodal point, and in the United States they have Donald Trump and Mr. Bolton. Mr. Bolton has never seen an intervention he didn't like. And so, as we say in Spanish, cuidado, careful. Mm-hmm. But even I think this would be a very difficult situation. The vast majority of Venezuelans oppose an intervention. The opposition opposes an intervention. It's not that simple.
I want to just come briefly back to our title, Ana. Power struggle. Who's going to win it?
Hopefully without military intervention, Guaidó and democracy in Venezuela.
Democracy will prevail. It has to.
The question is the time scale. It's not so clear. There could be if it doesn't come fairly rapidly, you could get a degeneration of the situation, and then all the players change their calculus.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. Thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. Hope to see you soon.